The third section of the United States Catholic Catechism for Adults covers the moral life. It's broken into two parts. The first part deals with laying down the foundation, the fundamental principles that we'll use when talking about moral situations. And then the second section gets into specific situations and teachings of the Church. So this video is going to cover chapters 23 and 24, which lay some of those principles. And they're pretty dense, so I'm hoping that I can get this in one video and everybody can follow it quite well. The first principle that the Catechism lays down is the fact that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. And this is going to become important when we're dealing with how we treat other human beings, especially in life issues, because it recognizes that human beings are different from all other life forms. We are made in the image and likeness of God. The animals aren't made that way. Not even the angels, for that matter, are made that way. And so human beings have a specific dignity given to them that needs to be respected. They are icons of God, and therefore we need to revere them as such. A second principle that gets laid out is the notion of freedom. So often when we think of freedom in our society, we think of it as the ability to make a choice, to do what I want to do, to choose what I want to do, how I want to act, how I want to entertain myself, those types of things. But freedom, as we understand it, true freedom, is given to us by God. And the freedom that God gives us isn't so much a choice as in choose what you'd like to do, tell us your preference, tell me your preference. Rather, it's the ability to choose God or to reject God. See, this way we're made different from all other creatures as well. Animals just act on instinct. So a squirrel acts like a squirrel just on instinct. But human beings, we're given this choice in our life to either choose to be with God, to live in relationship with Him, or to choose to live as we see fit apart from God. That's the choice that we're given. Now, in given this choice, we're not given it as if they're equal options. Rather, what God is doing is He's really giving us the option to choose to be with Him. And that's a great freedom that He gives us. And He doesn't give that to other creatures. He doesn't give them the choice of entering into a relationship with Him. But He does for us human beings. And the proper response is always, of course, to choose to live in accord with God, to choose to enter into that relationship with Him. That's the most humanizing thing that we can do, is to live according to the dignity with which we've been made in the image and likeness of God. Now, as we go on to consider moral acts, what we're going to have to look at is how does the Church evaluate things morally? And we begin by looking at what we call the moral object. And the moral object is what we're going to evaluate every time we have a moral dilemma or a moral decision to make. The moral object has three components. The first is the act itself. So whatever act that we're looking at doing. The second component is the situations surrounding that act, the particular context in which that act is being carried out. And the third part of the moral object is the intent with which we're carrying out that act. Now, for a moral object to be good, all three of those things have to be either neutral or good. So if we say, when we're looking at a situation, that the act itself that we're doing, if we're contemplating doing something like torturing somebody, the Church says, well, that act is always wrong. So no matter what your circumstances or your intent is, it's always going to be wrong because the act itself is wrong. Similarly, if our intention is malaligned, we could do something maybe that might be good in some situations, but if we do it with the wrong intention, with an evil intention, it could be wrong. And finally, the situation itself. So an act might be something that's appropriate in certain contexts and inappropriate in other contexts. Perhaps it will create scandal. Or the classic example that I like to use when talking with kids is I'll ask them, is it wrong to push an old lady? And they'll usually say, yes, it is. And I say, well, suppose the circumstance, though, is that the old lady's about to get hit by a bus, and the only way you can save her is to push her. Is it wrong to push an old lady? And they'll say, well, gee, not in that case, I guess. So again, the circumstances sometimes can help flesh out whether an act is actually a good thing or a bad thing. And then, of course, we need to look at all three of those. As long as all three of those are neutral or good, we say the act is permissible or perhaps even praiseworthy. And if one of those things is off, we say the whole act cannot be done. The object itself, I should say, cannot be done if either the act, the intention, or the circumstances around the act prevent you from saying this is a good thing to do. One of the things that we have to recognize, of course, when we discuss morality is that sin is in fact a reality. This is something that many people in our culture reject. They just reject it, saying that it's really just a matter of personal preference and what you believe. So it's right for you or it's wrong for you, but it's not for me. The church doesn't teach this at all. We say there are things that are right and there are things that are wrong. And you don't need to look around too hard at our world to understand that sin is in fact a reality. There are certain things that everybody wants to condemn as being wrong. We can think of, any of the school shootings that we talk about or much of the violence in the world. We all recognize that that's wrong. Other things, there's things that we universally accept as being right. Concern for one another, trying to aid one another. Nobody sits here and says, well, that's right for you, but it's really not right for all people. We all know that when somebody needs our help and we have the ability to help them, that we should do so, that's a praiseworthy thing to do. So we can recognize right off the bat that there is sin in the world. And this means that we have to be conscious of this fact and try to avoid it whenever we can. And so certainly our moral study is going to lead us hopefully away from sin and then towards the opposite of sin, which is actually growing in virtue and grace. And we want to try to do that so that we can enter into that life with God again. The whole point of morality is to help us to enter into union with God. And so that's what we're striving to do. So we're striving to grow in virtue and grace. Going back to this notion of the reality of sin, sometimes I find people dismiss it because they think that God is too big to be concerned with little things in our lives. So I hear people all the time say, does God really care if and you fill in whatever? The answer that we learn from Scripture, though, is that God really does care, even about the most minute details of our life. He's not so big that he ignores the little things around us. In fact, Christ himself tells us that we have to get the little things right if we want to be trusted with bigger things. So one of the worst things we can do is just dismiss something as being, it's just a small sin or a little lie or something like that, because what we're going to find is that Christ tells us, if I can't trust you with these small things, then I certainly can't trust you with the big things. The second part of the moral life, the chapter 24, talks about some of our social dynamics and how we look at morality in terms of society. One of the things that it notes is that we as human beings are obligated to have concern for one another. So when we establish social order, we do so with the intent of creating a world that's just and fair for all people, that treats all people with the proper dignity due to them. So this means that in a society, what we can't look at is simply say, this is what's going to help most people. But rather, we have to be concerned about what's good for all people. What upholds the dignity for every human being. And that's what we have to strive for as a society. Another thing that the second chapter brings out is that in striving for a good society and striving to do good, we have to look at the laws that God has given to us, because those laws are established for our own good. And there's three types of laws, really. The book talks about two, but I'll introduce the third type as well. The three types of law are natural law, divine law, and human law. So natural law and divine law are established by God. Natural law is that which anybody can see just from nature itself. So you don't even have to be a believer to understand certain things. So for example, we could look out into the world and clearly see that human life should be respected. That is, if we're going to form a flourishing society, we can't just kill people willy-nilly, for example. And pretty much all people tend to agree with that. So there are certain things that just nature itself tells us. If we try to establish a society where everybody's lying or something like that, that's not going to form a productive society. We know that we need to have the ability to trust one another. We need to have the ability to do certain things like that. So that's natural law, things that we can just learn just by looking at nature itself and our human nature itself, and it just kind of makes sense with who we are. Certainly when we get into our sexuality, that becomes very important. The notion that, our bodies speak to us of a certain way that we're supposed to relate to one another. Then there's divine law. Divine law is that which has been revealed to us by God himself. So we can think of things such as the Ten Commandments. Some of those are actually found right within nature, but other things such as keeping the Lord's Day holy or not using the Lord's name in vain. Those are things that we know to be true because God has revealed them to be true. Now with both natural law and divine law, there are no exceptions because they come to us from God directly. And so what we say is that when God created these laws or established these laws, he did so in his infinite wisdom, and God can foresee every situation possible. And so there's no situation to which they don't apply. So they apply to every situation. They are universally true. The third type of law that we have is human law. These are laws that human beings make that are for the betterment of society. And to the extent that they are in accord with divine law and validly established, they are to be followed. So this would be like the laws of our society, for example. So we have certain laws that say, oh, you have to pay your taxes by a certain date. And to that extent, to the extent that they promote the well-being of our society and that they don't violate any of our divine laws, what's been divinely revealed to us through human nature or through Scripture itself, we're obliged to do them for the betterment of our society. So the fact that we need, roads to be paved or plowed in the case of upstate New York is important. And so we all have to pay our fair share so that the government will have the money to do that. That's the way we've established to do that. It doesn't mean that this is the only way this can be done. So human laws can, in fact, be changed. Also, there's a certain principle, we call it epikeia, it's a technical word, which means that with human laws, there could be situations that perhaps are not foreseen or intended by the law, so the law doesn't really apply in that circumstance. So we could think, for example, a classic example that people like to try to use, and again, we could argue this, but I'm just using it to give you an understanding of the principle of epikeia, is if you're at a stoplight, and it's 3 in the morning, and there are absolutely no other cars on the road, and you're absolutely certain of that, and you say, I'm going to run the stoplight even though it's red, because the spirit of the stoplight is to promote the flow of traffic, and there is no traffic, and so I'm going to go ahead and run it. That would not necessarily be a moral sin. Now, it doesn't mean that if a cop sees you do it, you're not getting a ticket or something like that, but the question of would it be something that we're morally obliged to follow a law when it doesn't seem to really apply to the circumstance that we're in, the answer to that question would be no. There could be situations that human beings, when writing the law, didn't foresee. And so to the extent that they didn't foresee this particular situation, and the situation seems to be better served by ignoring the law in this case, we would say we can claim epikeia. Again, it doesn't dismiss you from the civil consequences of that kind of law. So I just want to be clear on that. A couple other principles that are outlined in these chapters. One of them is that all of our laws and things, when we follow them, we have to do so with good conscience. This would be natural law, divine law. That means that we have the responsibility to form our conscience so that we know what's right and what's wrong. So often in Catholic morality, unfortunately, what's taught is people are taught to say, well, I can use my conscience as a way of absenting from the rules of the church. Particularly, this was taught with the issue of birth control and things like that. And we can say, well, in my conscience, I don't believe this rule to be binding on me. The problem is with that is your conscience, you always have to follow your conscience, but you also have a responsibility to form your conscience. So you could be guilty of not properly forming your conscience if you don't really sit down and understand what is it that the church is teaching about these issues, and how is it that I am called to follow these teachings. And this is going to lead me into the second principle that's outlined as well here that I wanted to cover, which is that the church is in fact an authoritative body when it comes to teaching. So the church has been given the authority by Christ to teach on matters of faith and morals. And this means that when she teaches on matters of faith or morals, we need to listen, and we need to truly try to integrate those teachings into our lives. So to the extent that we just simply say, well, the bishops say that and I don't agree with them, we're not really giving our assent to the teachings of the church, and we're denying the church's role as a legitimate and authoritative teacher, which is not a good thing because that authority was given to her by Christ himself. And so to an extent we're saying, I don't accept that Christ has truly endowed the church with this teaching authority. And ultimately you're questioning Christ himself. And so we don't want to do that. So it's important to understand that the church does in fact teach on matters of faith and morals, and she does so as an authoritative teacher, and she does so based on an authority that was given to her by Christ. So when she teaches on something, it becomes incumbent upon us to actually listen to what she's saying, listen to those reasons, and try to integrate them into our own life so that we can have a properly formed conscience when it comes to making moral decisions. We'll pick up next time with some of these specific commandments. In the meantime, I think this will generate a lot of discussion, and I hope that you do continue to discuss these in your small groups, and certainly email me with any questions that you have. God bless.